Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. So, how do scientists in HDFS know how often certain things are happening? Like, how do they count things on a really big scale to get things like marriage and divorce rates and birth rates and things like that? These are what I would call prevalence studies. There's a couple of different prevalence designs that we'll talk about. What they both have in common is that their goal is to essentially get an accurate count of something in the population. This information is often in the background. It sort of sets the stage for the issue we want to talk about. So we might want to know what the divorce rate is and if it's going up or down because we want to investigate something about the process of divorce. But the rate itself is important background information, and we need to have research in these areas because human beings are really, really bad at estimating prevalences without the help of science. The two designs I want to talk about are population statistics and social surveys. So let's start with population statistics. This is characterized by the use of archival records, and they are not sampled. The scientist does not take a sample of the archival records. They take the entire population because they have some kind of record that accounts for the entire population on that particular question. Where do these archival records come from? Typically from government. The United Nations collects statistics about all the countries on the globe. The U.S. Census Bureau collects statistics about people living in the United States and essentially households. The Census Bureau tracks who is living with whom, and the entire population. We have information, the federal government has information about every single household in the United States. At least theoretically they do. There's always some problems in implementation. But for the most part, we're looking at the entire population of the United States. The Centers for Disease Control tracks things like vital statistics. Those are births, deaths, marriages, divorces, those kinds of things. The Centers for Disease Control also tracks certain health problems. Anything that might pertain to the public health. So the CDC tracks vaccinations, tracks diseases that are communicable like tuberculosis and AIDS are tracked by the government. Anything like that has to do with public health. And the National Center for Education Statistics tracks education in the United States. To illustrate, some examples of these include the United Nations keeps track of birth rates for a bunch of countries, and the United Nations did not make this graphic, but someone used data from the United Nations to demonstrate declining birth rates in virtually every country around the world. It's really interesting information. You can kind of compare countries that have had historically low birth rates to countries that have had historically high birth rates, and you see that in virtually every case, whether they started out high or low, birth rates have been declining over the last several decades. So that's super interesting data. Centers for Disease Control tracks vital statistics. You can see there in the bottom left of the graphic. The source is named. It's the National Vital Statistics Report. So this is looking at birth rates by the mother's age, and you can see that most babies are born when their moms are in their late 20s or early 30s. That's when babies are being born. And despite the fact that we hear a lot about young teenage mothers and older, even postmenopausal women having babies, you can see those rates are actually quite low. Most babies are being born when their moms are in their 20s or 30s, which I guess is what we should expect. But that data comes from the CDC. An example of some of the data that comes from the National Center for Education Statistics Any educational institution that has any kind of funding from the government has to report certain things back to the government. And so the National Center for Education Statistics provides this kind of information. This is looking at the percent of high school completers by income level who enrolled in a 2 or 4 year college. And you can see that this won't surprise you that high-income kids are the most likely to be in college right after high school. 81% of them do. And middle-income kids are a little less likely, and low-income kids are a little less likely. But in all three groups, the number of high school graduates going to college has been increasing over the past few decades, and it appears that they've been increasing at roughly the same rate. So that's just really basic background information about how many high school graduates go on to college, and our government tracks that kind of information. So these numbers are based on the entire population. There's no sampling involved whatsoever. Everybody's included in there. And it's the use of archival records. These numbers were not collected for research purposes. They were collected by the government for other purposes, but researchers can use them. So that is the essence of population statistics. Some advantages of population statistics, essentially, because there's no sampling bias. And this is a huge benefit to the quality of our knowledge. There's no sampling bias whatsoever. So there's no selection bias, and there's no non-response bias because informed consent's not necessary. Everybody's data is there. The data are all anonymous, so we can never use this data to find out information about any one particular person, but the data are all there. And the advantage of having information without any kind of sampling bias is pretty overwhelming. These numbers are considered some of the best, most reliable information we have if it comes from reliable sources, and it's a population statistic. Are there downsides of population statistics? Well, there's always a downside to using archival records. The quality of the data is determined by the agency that collected it. So we can trust the data if the CDC is accurately counting births, right? You might know an occasional instance of someone who has a baby at home and takes a while to report that birth. It probably happens. The general consensus is it doesn't happen that much in almost any country anymore. Since about 1960, vital statistics have been quite good in most of the world. So in that case, that data, we can depend upon it. But not always can we depend upon the quality of archival record data. So we just have to keep in mind where it comes from. I would say the bigger limitation of population statistics is that the government doesn't collect information about everything we might want to know about. Specifically, if we want to know things that the only way you could ever get them is by asking people to report them to you, like their opinions, their beliefs, then population statistics can really never help us because governments just don't have that kind of information.